Hi, my name is Emily Carter. I'm 31 now, a woman who has clawed her way up from nothing, living in a small apartment above a bakery in Charleston, South Carolina. The scent of cinnamon rolls seeps through my floorboards every morning, a strange comfort in a life that has rarely offered softness. But before the hustle, before the survival, before the long nights staring at my laptop praying an investor would finally believe in me, there was a time when I thought my world was unbreakable. I thought my family was untouchable. I was wrong. I grew up in Ashford, Georgia, in a mansion that sat proudly at the top of a hill, framed by endless rows of roses. My mother planted them herself, hundreds of bushes in shades of white, crimson, and blush pink. She said roses were a symbol of love, that no matter the season, something in our lives should bloom. Our home smelled of those roses, mixed with the faint aroma of old books from my father's library. My father, Robert Carter, was a man everyone in town respected, a textile magnate whose factories were the lifeblood of our small city. He had a voice that carried across any room, a posture that spoke of quiet command, and a reputation for doing business with honor. My mother, Margaret, was his opposite in every way except loyalty. Where he was all steel and certainty, she was warmth and grace. She had soft brown eyes that lit up when she looked at me, like I was her favorite chapter in the story of her life. I was 9 years old when my perfect world bled into a nightmare. It was April, the kind of afternoon when sunlight filters through the trees in warm gold, and the air feels gentle against your skin. My mother and I were at the park not far from our home. I was laughing, the wind tugging at the kite my father had bought me for my birthday. I remember the ribbon tail spinning wildly, my sneakers kicking up little clouds of dust as I ran. Then my mother's voice changed. "Emily, behind me." It was firm but soft, the way she used to tell me to hold her hand before crossing a busy street. I turned and saw a man in a black jacket, his baseball cap pulled low. In his hand was something that made my stomach twist. A gun. He didn't look at my mother's face. His eyes locked on me. "Hand over the girl, and no one gets hurt." My mother's body stiffened, but her voice didn't waver. "You're not touching my daughter." Time seemed to slow. The breeze stilled. The sunlight dimmed. He raised the gun higher. I heard her shout, "Run, Emily!" But my feet wouldn't move. I stood there, frozen in some terrible dream, until the air shattered with the sound of 3 gunshots. 1, 2, 3. The world tilted. My knees buckled, but it wasn't my body that had been hit. It was hers. My mother crumpled in front of me, her blood staining the grass, her eyes searching for me one last time. I crawled to her, screaming her name, pressing my hands to the wound as if I could force life back into her. But her warmth was fading, and her breathing stopped before help could come. The police caught him hours later, a desperate addict who thought ransoming the daughter of a wealthy man would save him from debt. He never expected my mother, small and delicate, to fight for me like a soldier on a battlefield. She died a hero, and I was left with the crushing weight of knowing she died because I was there. After that day, our house wasn't a home. It was a mausoleum. The roses outside bloomed as beautifully as ever, but their scent made me sick. My father, once the embodiment of strength, became a hollow version of himself. He shut himself away in his study, nursing grief in silence. I tried to be invisible, thinking that maybe if I stayed quiet enough, I wouldn't cause any more harm. I never told anyone, but I blamed myself. I replayed that moment over and over. If I had run when she told me, if I had moved faster, maybe she would still be alive. 3 years later, my father brought someone new into our lives. Her name was Veronica. I will never forget the first time I saw her standing in our dining room under the chandelier's golden light. She was beautiful in a way that made the air feel colder. Blonde hair like spun silk, green eyes with no warmth at all. My father introduced her as if it were nothing. "Emily, this is Veronica. She's going to be part of our family." Our family. As far as I knew, that word was buried with my mother. From that night on, Veronica made sure I knew my place. And it wasn't at the center of my father's life anymore. The curtains my mother had chosen, gone. Her paintings, replaced. The scent of roses in the house, overpowered by Veronica's heavy, cloying perfume. And then came the ultimate proof. 2 new children, Lucas and Sophie, both blonde, both green-eyed, both the mirror image of her. Veronica made it no secret that they were my father's real joy. I overheard her once telling a friend on the phone, "Emily's just leftover from his first life." I learned to live in the shadows, to keep my head down. By the time I turned 18, I packed my life into a single suitcase and left with a scholarship to the University of Georgia. I didn't look back. But fate wasn't done with me. Years later, when I'd fought tooth and nail to build a life without my father's money, a phone call yanked me back into that cold house on the hill. The voice on the other end was flat and businesslike. "Robert Carter is in the hospital, terminal lung cancer. He wants to see you." I hadn't spoken to him in over a decade. I didn't know if I could face him or Veronica, but a part of me, a wounded little girl clutching at the memory of roses, needed to go. When I arrived, Veronica met me at the door with a look that could freeze boiling water. "What are you doing here? He doesn't need you." But I walked past her anyway. I found my father lying in a bed that smelled of antiseptic and surrender, his once broad shoulders now fragile under the thin blanket. His voice was a whisper, but when he said my name, Emily, it was like hearing it through the walls of time. That visit would change everything. And when he died 6 months later, Veronica thought she had finally erased me from his life for good. She even called to say it herself. "The will's finalized. You get nothing. Everything is mine and my children's." She didn't know my father had left something no one could take from me. Not her, not Lucas, not Sophie. Something that would make her regret underestimating me. Because I wasn't the scared little girl she thought I was anymore. I had been quiet for years. Now, it was my turn to speak. If you've ever been told you don't belong, or watched someone try to erase you from your own story, keep listening. You'll want to hear exactly how this ended. Like, comment, and share if you've ever been underestimated, and watch what happens next. The morning after my father first brought Veronica into our home, I woke to a silence that didn't feel like peace. It felt like something was lurking in the walls, like the air itself had shifted overnight. I padded barefoot down the hallway, past the rose-patterned wallpaper my mother had chosen years before. At the end of the corridor, voices murmured, low, close, conspiratorial. My father's was warm but tired. Veronica's was smooth, with a sweetness that sounded more like sugar-masking poison. When I stepped into the kitchen, Veronica's eyes darted to me. Her lips curved into a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, Emily," she said. But the way she lingered on my name made it sound like an inconvenience. She was dressed like she had a business meeting. Cream blouse, pearls, her hair pulled back so tight it seemed her face couldn't move. She was stunning in that expensive magazine cover way. But something in me recoiled instantly. My mother's beauty had always been an open door, warm, inviting, safe. Veronica's was a locked gate with barbed wire. My father cleared his throat. "Emily, Veronica's going to stay with us for a while." A while. That phrase would later prove to mean forever. At first, I told myself maybe I was imagining the frost in her tone, the subtle tilts of her head when she looked at me, like I was an item on a shelf she didn't want in her collection. But the changes began almost immediately. 3 days after she arrived, I came home from school to find the living room stripped of its heart. The curtains my mother had picked, soft ivory linen with delicate embroidery, were gone, replaced with heavy crimson drapes that made the room feel smaller, darker. The watercolor painting my mother had made of the rose garden had been taken down, replaced with a massive gold-framed mirror. When I asked where the painting was, Veronica smiled and said, "It didn't really fit the aesthetic I'm going for." Aesthetic. My mother's memory had been reduced to a design choice she could simply erase. I remember running outside to check the roses. They were still there, blooming bravely in the spring sunlight. But their scent seemed weaker, almost as if even they sensed something invasive rooting itself in our home. My father didn't notice, or pretended not to. He was lighter with Veronica, laughing more than he had in years. Maybe he thought this was healing. Maybe he thought filling the silence with her chatter could patch over the hollow space my mother left behind. But to me, it felt like betrayal. School became my refuge. I'd linger long after classes ended, helping teachers straighten up their rooms, shelving books in the library, anything to delay walking back into that house. But even there, Veronica found ways to make her presence known. She would forget to pick me up from my after-school club, forcing me to walk home along the long, winding road alone. She'd tell my father I hadn't thanked her for dinner, even on nights when I'd choked out the words despite her icy stares. The first Christmas she spent with us was the moment I realized she wasn't going anywhere. The tree, once trimmed in gold and white like my mother always did, was now a dizzying mess of clashing ornaments. Red, silver, glittering green, a display that screamed for attention. My mother's angel ornament, the one we placed on the top together every year, was gone. When I asked about it, Veronica's voice was sweet enough to rot my teeth. "Oh, that old thing? It was chipped. I threw it out. We can't have broken things cluttering up the holidays." I didn't say a word, but inside, something hardened. The day Lucas was born, I stood in the hospital hallway while my father paced with excitement. Veronica's parents had flown in, bustling past me with flowers and gifts. No one asked if I wanted to hold him. No one even looked at me. 2 years later, Sophie arrived, and just like that, my father's life revolved around Veronica and her children. The photos on the mantelpiece changed. Where once there had been smiling snapshots of me and my parents in the rose garden, now there were pictures of Lucas in tiny tuxedos, Sophie in frilly dresses, and Veronica beaming like she'd won a prize. I started disappearing in plain sight. One night, when I was 14, I dropped a glass in the kitchen. It shattered across the tile. I bent down to pick up the pieces, my hands trembling. Veronica's heels clicked into the room. She stopped, crossed her arms, and smirked. "He's such a troublemaker, isn't he?" she said loudly to the housekeeper, her voice sharp enough to cut. Then she glanced down at me, her tone dripping with disdain. "No wonder your father works so hard. Cleaning up after useless messes must be exhausting." I froze, a shard of glass digging into my palm. But I didn't answer. Giving her silence was the only power I had left. By the time I was 17, I had stopped trying to win my father's attention back. He would knock on my door late at night, asking if I wanted to talk, his voice quiet, almost unsure. Sometimes I heard the ache in it, the way he was reaching for something already slipping through his fingers. But I couldn't give him what he wanted. Every time I looked at him, I saw my mother's blood on the grass. So I shut the door, and the gap between us widened into an unbridgeable canyon. The morning I left for college was the last time I saw the rose bushes. Veronica had cut most of them back, replacing them with neatly trimmed boxwoods. I stood at the gate with my suitcase, my father behind me, his voice soft. "Call me if you need anything, Emily." I nodded, but didn't look back. If I had, I might have run into his arms and forgiven him too soon. Charleston was a new beginning. I lived in a dorm so small I could touch both walls at once, but it was mine. I worked 3 jobs, tutoring high school kids in math, waiting tables at a diner, and managing social media for a small boutique. Every dollar I made went toward tuition and the dream of one day standing on my own without a single cent of Carter money. But dreams have weight, and mine was crushing. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had poured everything into a startup I believed could revolutionize the textile industry. It was my way of taking back the only part of my father's legacy I still valued, the craft he built his empire on, but doing it on my own terms. The nights were long, the bank balance thin, the fear constant. But I refused to call him. I refused to give Veronica even the satisfaction of knowing I needed help. I thought I'd finally buried my old life. I thought wrong. The call about my father's illness didn't just open an old wound. It tore it wide open. I didn't know it then, but returning to that house would set in motion the final, quiet revenge I never planned, but couldn't ignore. The drive back to Ashford felt like moving through a dream I'd already had 1,000 times, the kind where everything looks familiar, but wrong. The streets were the same, the air still carried the faint scent of pine and distant rain, but my chest felt heavier with every mile. I hadn't been back in over a decade. I thought I'd feel nothing, that I'd step into this place like it was just another building, stripped of any claim over me. But as I turned the final corner and the house came into view, my stomach dropped. The mansion still stood tall on its hill, framed now by manicured hedges where my mother's roses used to be. The lawn was a perfect, uniform green. No wildflowers, no sunlight spilling over tangled blooms. It was beautiful in the way a luxury hotel lobby is beautiful, polished, empty, and soulless. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the massive front door. The last time I'd walked through it, I'd been 18, clutching my suitcase like a lifeline. Now I had no suitcase, just a small duffel bag and the growing sense that I was walking into enemy territory. The door swung open before I could knock. Veronica stood there. Her hair was as flawless as ever, gleaming gold under the morning light. She wore a fitted black dress, heels clicking against the marble floor. But it was her eyes, cold, assessing, that made me feel like I was back in that kitchen at 14, a shard of glass in my palm and her smirk cutting deeper than the wound. "What are you doing here?" she asked. No pretense, no polite small talk. Just the sharp edge of someone who'd been dreading this moment. "I'm here to see my father," I said, my voice even. Her mouth twisted into a thin smile. "He doesn't need you here." I didn't answer. I brushed past her, the faint scent of her perfume following me like smoke. Inside, the house felt colder than I remembered. The air conditioning was cranked too high, the silence broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Everywhere I looked, the evidence of my erasure was complete. The photographs on the walls were of Veronica, Lucas, and Sophie. Vacations, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. Not a single picture of me or my mother. It was as if we had been scraped out of the family history altogether. My father's bedroom had been moved downstairs, converted from the old sunroom into a sterile, hospital-like space. The warm light that used to pour into that room was blocked by blackout curtains. Machines hummed softly, their screens blinking. He looked smaller. His broad frame had withered into something fragile, his once thick hair now silver white. His eyes, though tired, lit up when he saw me. "Emily," he whispered, his voice catching. I moved to his side, took his hand. It was cold, but he squeezed mine with what little strength he had left. "I'm here," I said softly. Veronica lingered in the doorway like a shadow that wouldn't leave. "Don't tire him out," she warned, as if I were some disruptive child. I ignored her, pulling a chair close to his bed. We talked, or tried to. He asked about my work, my life in Charleston. I gave him the bare outlines, leaving out the nights I'd stared at an empty bank account, wondering how I'd keep my business afloat. I didn't want him to hear desperation in my voice. I wanted him to see that I was standing on my own, even if my knees shook under the weight of it. He didn't talk much about himself, but I could see the toll illness had taken. His breaths were shallow, his shoulders tense with each one. Still, there was something in his gaze, an urgency, a need to say things before time ran out. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Every moment I tried to spend with my father, Veronica, or one of her children found a way to intrude. One afternoon, I brought him a book we used to read together when I was little, an old copy of The Secret Garden with my mother's handwriting on the inside cover. He smiled when he saw it, running a weak hand over the faded pages. But before I could read more than a paragraph aloud, Veronica swept in, her voice like a whip. "Don't bring useless things in here. He needs rest, not childish stories." She plucked the book from my hands and tossed it onto a chair, where it sat, ignored. My father's eyes followed it, but he said nothing. Another time I offered to bring him breakfast myself. Oatmeal, toast, nothing fancy, just so we could share a quiet morning. But when I came downstairs, the tray was gone. Veronica's voice floated from the kitchen. "He already ate. No need to bother." It was a constant, subtle war. She didn't scream, didn't throw me out outright. Instead, she tightened the walls around him until there was barely room for me inside. At night, I slept on the living room couch. Veronica insisted there was no space for me in the guest rooms, despite the fact that the house had 5 of them. She walked past me once as I was making up the couch with a thin blanket, pausing just long enough to say, "This is temporary. Don't get comfortable." I thought about snapping back, about reminding her this had been my home long before it was hers. But then I thought of my father, lying in that dim room, and bit my tongue. Lucas and Sophie, teenagers now, were no better. They looked at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. One evening, Sophie asked bluntly, "Why are you even here? You're not really family." Lucas snorted in agreement, muttering something I couldn't quite catch. I didn't respond. I'd learned years ago that feeding their cruelty only made them hungrier. One night, close to midnight, the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint whoosh of the air vents. I slipped into my father's room while the nurse was on break. The bedside lamp cast a soft circle of light over him. He stirred when I sat down, his eyes opening slowly. "Emily," he murmured. I reached for his hand. "I'm here, Dad." For a long moment, he just looked at me, like he was memorizing my face. Then his voice cracked. "I've followed you all these years. I know you worked hard." "I know. I wasn't there for you. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how, and I was afraid you still hated me." My throat tightened. "I don't hate you. I hesitated. I didn't know how to forgive." He closed his eyes briefly, as if my words were both a relief and a weight. "I can't change the past," he whispered, "but I can leave something for your future. I've always believed in you, Emily, even if I didn't say it enough." I didn't cry easily anymore, but in that moment, I felt the hot sting in my eyes. I leaned forward, hugging him gently, feeling the frail rise and fall of his chest. Neither of us knew that night would be the last real conversation we'd ever have. 6 months after that last conversation, the phone rang close to midnight. I was at my desk in Charleston, surrounded by stacks of invoices and a half-finished cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. Veronica. Her tone was clipped, businesslike, as though she were reading from a note card. "Robert passed this afternoon. The will's been finalized. There's nothing for you. Everything is mine and my children's." She let the words hang in the air, waiting for me to react. I didn't. I simply said, "I understand," and ended the call before she could add anything more. It wasn't the money. It was the reality that my father had died without me there, without me holding his hand, without hearing me say goodbye. I sat in the dark, listening to the hum of my refrigerator, the stillness pressing in on me like a weight. For years, I had built walls to protect myself from this family, but grief has a way of finding cracks. I didn't plan to go to the funeral. Part of me thought staying away would be easier. But a deeper part, the part that still remembered my father carrying me on his shoulders through the rose garden, knew I had to be there. The day of the service, I drove to Dalton and parked far from the Carter family plot. The cemetery stretched out under a cloudless sky, the air heavy with summer heat. People in black moved slowly between the gravestones, murmuring in low voices. I stayed at a distance, standing under the shade of an old oak tree as the casket was lowered into the earth. My father's name, Robert James Carter, gleamed on the polished wood, flanked by white lilies. The pastor's voice floated over the crowd, speaking of legacy, of hard work, of devotion. Veronica stood front and center, a picture of composure in an expensive black dress and oversized sunglasses that hid her eyes. Lucas and Sophie stood on either side of her, their expressions caught between feigned sorrow and boredom. They shifted their weight, glanced at each other, as if the whole thing were a formality they couldn't wait to end. When the final prayer was spoken and the crowd began to disperse, I remained under the tree. I wasn't here for the people. I was here for him. Veronica spotted me on her way to the car. She paused, her lips curling in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You don't belong here, Emily. Don't come back." Lucas smirked. "Yeah, you're not family." Sophie, younger but no less venomous, added, "Mom's right. You're just trouble." I lowered my head, letting them walk past without a word. The sound of Veronica's heels on the gravel faded into the distance. When they were gone, I stepped forward to the fresh mound of earth. The headstone had already been placed, a simple slab of gray granite with his name and dates carved deep. No flowers, no mention of the wife he had lost, the daughter he had left behind. I rested my hand on the cool stone. "I'm sorry, Dad," I whispered. "I wasn't there when you needed me most." The tears came quietly, slipping down my cheeks and soaking into the ground. It wasn't until I heard a throat clear behind me that I realized I wasn't alone. A man in a charcoal suit stood a few paces away. He was tall, with graying hair and a leather folder tucked under one arm. "Miss Carter?" he asked. I wiped my face quickly. "Yes? My name is Daniel Foster. I was your father's attorney. I understand you were not contacted for the reading of the will." I shook my head. Veronica made it pretty clear there was nothing for me. His gaze sharpened slightly, but his voice remained even. "That's not entirely accurate. There are matters we should discuss, privately." The words settled in my stomach like a stone. Veronica had said the will was finalized, that everything had gone to her and the children. I had believed her, or maybe I had wanted to. It was easier to accept being erased than to hope I hadn't been. But the look in Daniel's eyes told me there was more to this story. We arranged to meet at his office 2 days later. Those 48 hours stretched endlessly, my mind circling questions I didn't dare ask aloud. What could my father possibly have left me? Why hadn't I been told sooner? And if there was something, why keep it a secret from Veronica? When I walked into the law office, Daniel was already waiting, the leather folder on the desk between us. Your father's official will leaves the estate, the house, the cars, the bank accounts, to Veronica and her children, he began. I know, I said flatly. But, he continued, sliding a sealed envelope toward me, there was a separate directive, a private one. This was not shared at the public reading. I stared at the envelope. My name, Emily Grace Carter, was written on it in my father's handwriting. The same looping script I remembered from birthday cards and notes he used to leave me in my lunchbox as a child. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Just one sentence, written in pen. The controlling shares of Carter Textiles belong to my daughter, Emily Grace Carter. I looked up at Daniel, my voice barely a whisper. This means... It means, he said, that while Veronica owns the assets, you own the company. The business itself, the name, the legacy. For a moment I couldn't breathe. It wasn't money, it wasn't property, it was something far more powerful, control, and as the weight of that reality sank in, I knew exactly what Veronica's reaction would be. I sat in Daniel Foster's office long after the words had been spoken, my fingers still tracing the single line my father had left me. The controlling shares of Carter Textiles belong to my daughter, Emily Grace Carter. It wasn't wealth in the way Veronica measured it. No sprawling mansion, no fleet of cars, no designer jewelry she could drape over herself like armor. This was different. This was the foundation of everything my father had ever built. This was the heartbeat of the Carter name. And now it was mine. Daniel watched me carefully, as if waiting for the truth to settle in. Your father made it clear this was his wish, he said. It's not contestable. He structured it in a way that keeps it separate from the estate. Veronica can't touch it. The air in the room felt sharper, cleaner somehow. For years, I'd lived with the belief that I'd been erased, written out of the story entirely. But here it was, proof that beneath all the silence and the distance, my father had still seen me, still believed in me. I swallowed hard. Why didn't he tell me? Daniel's expression softened. He wanted to, but he knew Veronica would make his final days even harder if she found out. He told me you'd understand when the time came. Understand. The word echoed in my chest. I thought of that night in his room, the way he'd squeezed my hand and told me he'd always believed in me. At the time, I'd heard regret in his voice. Now I realized there had been something else, too. Certainty. Walking out of the office, the late afternoon sun hit me full in the face. The world looked the same, cars passing, people chatting on the sidewalk, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery next door. But inside, something had shifted. I wasn't powerless anymore. The drive back to Charleston was quiet. My mind kept drifting between memories of the past and visions of the future. I saw my mother in the rose garden, her hands dirt-stained, her face lit with the joy of creation. I saw my father in his office, drafting plans, meeting with factory managers, building something that would outlast him. Now it was in my hands, not to burn it down, not to sell it off for quick cash, but to shape it into something worthy of both their names and mine. The first call came the next morning. Veronica. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won. What do you think you're doing? Her voice was tight, each word clipped. Good morning to you too, I said, keeping my tone calm. Don't play games with me, Emily. You think owning a few pieces of paper makes you important? The estate is mine. Everything your father left is mine. You have nothing. I almost laughed. Except the company. Silence, just the faint sound of her breath on the other end. then low and sharp. "You won't last a month." She hung up before I could reply. It would have been easy to dive in head first, to call a board meeting, to make a grand announcement. But my father's gift wasn't a weapon to swing recklessly. I needed to learn the inner workings of Carter Textiles, not from the outside, but from the inside, quietly, without drawing attention. For weeks, I immersed myself in reports, contracts, production schedules. I visited factories unannounced, walking the floor in jeans and sneakers so no one would peg me as the new owner. I spoke with workers, asking questions, listening more than I talked. It didn't take long to see where the cracks were forming. Corners had been cut under Veronica's influence. Cheaper materials, reduced safety measures, high turnover. She'd been bleeding the company slowly, like a parasite feeding without killing the host. At least not yet. And now I understood her panic. With control in my hands, her quiet siphoning days were over. One evening, I sat at my small kitchen table in Charleston, papers spread out before me. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment. I ran my fingers over the original charter for Carter Textiles, my father's signature inked alongside my grandfather's. This wasn't just a business. It was a legacy, one my mother had stood beside every step of the way, even if her name was never on the letterhead. I thought back to the way Veronica had replaced the rose garden with manicured hedges, how she had scrubbed my mother from the house. She'd done the same here, stripping the company of its care, its roots, its soul. That was going to change. Not with shouting matches, not with lawsuits, not with public scenes, but with action. Quiet, calculated, unstoppable. The next time I saw Veronica was at a shareholder event, a formal dinner at one of the city's oldest hotels. She didn't know I'd be there until I stepped into the ballroom, wearing a simple black dress my mother had once worn to one of my father's galas. Heads turned, conversations paused. Her smile was tight, brittle. "Emily," she said, her voice just loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "I didn't realize you were involved in these matters." I smiled back. I am now. It wasn't the place for more, not yet. But the way her eyes narrowed told me she could feel the ground shifting under her feet. Back in Charleston that night, I stood by my window, looking out at the quiet street below. I could almost hear my father's voice, steady and low. "Build something worth keeping." That was exactly what I intended to do. But I also knew this. Sooner or later, Veronica was going to come at me with everything she had left. And when she did, she'd discover I wasn't the silent, defeated girl she'd once pushed to the edges of the family photo. This time, I had something she couldn't take, and I knew exactly how to use it. The morning after the shareholder dinner, I woke up before sunrise. The air in Charleston was heavy with that strange stillness that comes right before a storm. I brewed coffee, sat at my small kitchen table, and laid out every document I had on Carter Textiles. It wasn't just numbers and charts anymore. It was a map, a battle plan. I remembered my father's voice the night before he died. "I can't change the past, but I can leave something for your future." Back then, I hadn't realized how deliberate he'd been. He hadn't left me a gift. He'd left me a responsibility and a weapon. The first move was subtle. I scheduled a private meeting with the executive board. No press releases, no big announcements, just a simple agenda. Review of current operations and strategic direction. When I walked into the conference room, I could feel the unease ripple through the group. Some of them had never seen me before. Others had heard of me only through Veronica's lens, the estranged daughter, the troublemaker, the leftover from his first life. I introduced myself calmly, then pulled up the first slide of my presentation. A comparison of production quality and safety statistics from the last 5 years. The drop in numbers was sharp, undeniable. I let the silence stretch after each chart, forcing them to sit with the truth. "This," I said finally, "is not my father's company. This is not the standard Robert Carter built, and it will not be the standard going forward." Some shifted uncomfortably. A few nodded. No one spoke. After the meeting, I stayed behind with two senior members who had been with the company since before Veronica entered the picture: Harold Jenkins, head of operations, and Ellen Price, director of quality control. Harold's face was etched with lines of exhaustion, but his handshake was firm. "I've been waiting a long time for someone to say what you just said." Ellen glanced toward the door, lowering her voice. "Veronica's been cutting costs for years, pushing through changes that hurt production, but no one's challenged her because she controls the estate," I finished for her. Ellen nodded. "And she made sure everyone believed she controlled the company too." I looked at them both. "That ends now." The second move came 2 weeks later. I called an all-hands meeting at the main factory, the first in over a decade. Workers looked surprised to see me standing there, microphone in hand, in jeans and a simple blouse instead of a suit. I told them who I was. I told them what my father built, what my mother stood beside him to protect, and how far the company had drifted from that vision. I promised that changes were coming, changes they'd see and feel. And then I asked them the question no one had bothered to ask in years. "What do you need to do your job well?" Hands went up. People spoke about broken equipment, unsafe conditions, low morale. I wrote down every word. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about showing them that the person at the top actually listened, something Veronica had never done. Of course, word got back to her. She called me that night, her voice sharp with barely contained rage. "You think you can walk in there and play the hero? You don't have the experience to run a company like this." "I have something you don't," I said evenly. "Oh?" she sneered. "The legal right to do it." The silence on the line was almost satisfying. Almost. Then she hissed, "You'll regret this." In the weeks that followed, I worked quietly but decisively. We reinstated safety checks that had been scrapped. We brought back higher quality materials. We even rehired several skilled workers who had been pushed out under Veronica's management. The numbers began to climb, slowly at first, then more noticeably. And with every improvement, her grip on the narrative loosened. The breaking point came at the quarterly shareholders meeting. Veronica arrived in a crimson dress, her smile as polished as her diamonds. She clearly expected to dominate the room, to use her position as executor of the estate to sway the conversation. But this time, I was at the head of the table. I presented the same charts I'd shown in my first private meeting, but now with an added slide. Projected growth, based on the changes we'd implemented. The improvement was undeniable. When I finished, I set down the clicker and said, "This is the direction Carter Textiles will continue to move in. Quality first, people first, profits will follow." One of the older shareholders, a man who had known my father for decades, nodded. "Sounds like Robert's vision," he said. Veronica's smile faltered for the first time that day. After the meeting, she cornered me in the hallway, her voice low and venomous. "You may have the company, Emily, but I still have everything else. Don't forget that." I met her gaze steadily. "Maybe, but without the company, all you have is a house full of things you didn't earn." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't answer. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the tile like the ticking of a clock. And I knew. Her time was running out. It started small, a misplaced document here, a delayed delivery there. At first I thought it was just the natural friction of change, but after the third miscommunication in less than a week, I knew better. Veronica was testing me. One Monday morning, Harold, the head of operations, came into my office looking uneasy. He closed the door behind him. "Emily, the shipment to our biggest client in New York was rerouted. Somehow it ended up sitting in a warehouse in Florida for 3 days. They're threatening to cancel the order." I sat back in my chair. "Who authorized the reroute?" Harold hesitated. "The paperwork says it came from the estate's logistics oversight team, which doesn't exist unless it's Veronica," I finished for him. He nodded grimly. It was clever in its way. The estate didn't officially control operations, but Veronica still had contacts, old favors she could call in from people who owed her or feared her. She was trying to make me look incompetent, to stir doubts among the board and shareholders. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a single thought running through my mind. She wants me to fight her in the open. That's where she's strongest. So I'll make sure the fight happens where she's weakest. I called Daniel Foster, my father's attorney. He answered on the second ring. "I need to know every single boundary between the company and the estate," I told him. "Every dotted line, every clause, every possible point where she might try to push in." Daniel didn't even ask why. "I'll have it on your desk in 2 days." In the meantime, I stayed calm. If Veronica expected me to lash out, to accuse her publicly, I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I made a point of visiting the factories more often, talking to workers, strengthening relationships that went deeper than titles and contracts. At one plant, a woman named Rosa took me aside. "We hear things," she said quietly. "People saying shipments will get lost, orders will be wrong, just so they can say you can't run things. We know who's behind it." Her loyalty hit me harder than the rumors. It meant Veronica's poison wasn't spreading as far as she thought. People had seen enough of her leadership to know what she was capable of. 2 days later, Daniel delivered. His folder was thick, but one section caught my eye immediately. A clause in the corporate charter stating that any interference from outside entities with controlling operations could be considered grounds for legal action. And outside entities included the estate, no matter who ran it. It wasn't just a shield, it was a sword. The next time a shipment went missing, this time to a luxury hotel chain in Chicago, I was ready. I let the problem play out for 48 hours, long enough for the client to send a strongly worded email, long enough for the tension to ripple through the board. Then I called an emergency meeting. The room was tense when I arrived. Veronica was there too, uninvited, sitting in one of the chairs along the wall like she owned the place. She wore her usual smile, all polished charm and false innocence. I started with the facts, the rerouted shipments, the delays, the financial impact. I laid out the dates, the names, the signatures. Then I put up the final slide, a copy of the corporate charter with the relevant clause highlighted in bold. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is the line that has been crossed, and this is the clause that makes such interference grounds for immediate removal of any parties involved from all company dealings, permanently." A ripple went through the room. I could see Veronica's smile tightening, the edges straining to hold. One of the shareholders cleared his throat. "Are you saying the estate has been interfering?" I didn't look at her when I answered. "I'm saying that someone without legal authority has been making operational decisions, and those decisions have cost us both money and reputation. If it happens again, we will pursue legal action." The silence that followed was heavy. Veronica stood, smoothing the front of her dress. I think we all know what's being implied here. And I'll simply say this: some people aren't cut out for responsibility. I turned to face her fully for the first time. "You're right. Some people aren't." Her cheeks flushed, but she walked out without another word. Later that evening, I got a text from Harold. No lost shipments today. Wonder why. It was a small victory, but it was more than that. It was proof. She'd wanted me to stumble in public. Instead, she'd walked herself to the edge of a very visible cliff. But Veronica wasn't the kind to retreat quietly. The next move wouldn't be about the company. It would be about me. I knew it the moment Daniel called and said, "Emily, she started spreading something personal, and she's not doing it quietly." What she didn't realize was that her attempt to destroy my name would give me exactly the moment I needed. The moment to turn every eye in the room toward her and let her reveal herself for what she truly was. Daniel's warning replayed in my mind as I drove to Atlanta the next morning. She started spreading something personal, and she's not doing it quietly. It didn't take long to find out what that something was. According to Daniel, Veronica had been whispering to board members, suppliers, even a few factory managers, that I was only in control because I'd manipulated my father when he was sick, that I'd pressured him into giving me the company, cutting her and the kids out of the legacy he intended for them. She painted me as an opportunist, a cold daughter who swooped in at the end to steal what wasn't hers. It was exactly the kind of poison she knew how to drip. Not an outright accusation, but enough to make people doubt. If I confronted her privately, she'd just deny it. If I tried to defend myself quietly, the damage would linger. No, this had to end where everyone could see it. The opportunity came faster than I expected. 2 weeks later, Carter Textiles was hosting its annual gala, an event my father had started decades ago to honor major clients and celebrate employee milestones. It had been neglected under Veronica's influence, reduced to a stiff dinner where she paraded her wealth. But this year, it was mine to host. The ballroom was breathtaking that night. White roses, my mother's roses, lined the tables. Photographs of workers and their families were displayed along the walls, a reminder of who the company truly served. I made sure the event felt less like a fundraiser and more like a homecoming. Veronica arrived fashionably late, of course, wearing a floor-length emerald gown that seemed designed to catch every light in the room. She floated from group to group, smiling, laughing, and I knew, continuing her little campaign in the corners. The speeches began after dinner. I'd planned to keep mine simple, thank our partners, honor our employees, reaffirm the direction of the company. But as I stood backstage, watching her work the room, I realized something. This was the stage she thought she owned, and tonight I was going to take it from her. When my name was announced, I stepped up to the microphone. The applause was warm, genuine. I smiled, scanning the room until my eyes landed on her. She was seated near the front, her posture relaxed, that faint smirk tugging at her lips. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," I began. "Carter Textiles has always been more than a business. It's a legacy. One my grandfather built, one my father protected, and one I am honored to carry forward." I paused, letting the words settle. Some of you may have heard stories that I came into this position under questionable circumstances, that I didn't earn it. A ripple moved through the crowd. Veronica's smirk faltered just slightly. I reached into the folder on the podium and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the original handwritten directive from my father. This is my father's private instruction, dated and witnessed 6 months before his passing. In his own words, "The controlling shares of Carter Textiles belong to my daughter, Emily Grace Carter." I held it up so everyone could see. There was no manipulation, no coercion. This was his choice, because he believed in my vision, just as he believed in my work long before I ever sat in this chair. The room was silent for a beat. Then I added, But that's not the only reason I'm here. I'm here because I love this company. I'm here because I refuse to let anyone, inside or outside, strip it of the values it was built on. And I'm here because I believe that a legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn every single day. Applause broke out. Not the polite kind, but the deep, sustained kind that fills a room. I glanced at Veronica. Her cheeks were flushed, her jaw tight. She clapped exactly twice, then set her hands in her lap. After the speeches, I moved through the crowd, thanking people, listening to their ideas for the company. The shift was palpable. The questions weren't about whether I belonged anymore, but about what I planned to do next. At one point, Harold leaned in and said quietly, "You didn't just shut her down tonight. You reminded them all what Carter Textiles used to stand for." I smiled, but inside I felt something else. A quiet, steady resolve. This wasn't about winning one night. This was about making sure she never had the chance to pull the company back into her orbit again. Veronica left early, without saying goodbye. I watched her emerald gown disappear through the double doors, and for the first time since this battle began, I knew she understood. The room was no longer hers, and soon nothing else would be either. The Monday after the gala felt different from any Monday I'd known in years. When I walked into Carter Textiles headquarters, the greetings were warmer, the handshakes firmer. People didn't avert their eyes anymore. They met my gaze like they finally knew who was steering the ship. The press had picked up snippets of my speech, just enough to hint at a quiet family drama without giving the tabloids a feast. One business journal ran a headline that made me smirk. "From outcast to owner, Emily Carter revives family legacy." But not everyone was clapping. By mid-morning, Daniel called me into his office. "She's not taking this lying down," he said, sliding a printed email across his desk. It was from one of our suppliers, addressed to me but CC'd to the board. In it, they expressed concerns about sudden management changes and hinted they'd been approached with a better offer. From a party with deep ties to the Carter family estate. Veronica wasn't just nursing her wounded pride. She was trying to choke the company through its supply chain. I took a deep breath, the way my father used to when someone challenged him in a meeting. "All right," I said. "Then we remind them who they're really doing business with." Within the hour, I was on the phone with that supplier, not with threats, but with facts. The new contracts we'd implemented that improved turnaround times, the safety protocols that reduced defects, the bonuses we'd reinstated for consistent quality. By the end of the call, they agreed to not only honor the current contract, but to extend it by another year. I hung up and sent a brief email to Daniel. First crack sealed. The thing about Veronica was that she thrived in the shadows, in whispers, in closed-door exchanges, in the kind of half-truths that couldn't be disproven without dragging everyone into the mud. But after the gala, the shadows were thinner. People who'd once feared her influence now sensed it was fading. Some started coming to me quietly with stories, little things she'd done over the years that they'd stayed silent about. One former accountant admitted she'd been pressured to adjust certain expense reports. A mid-level manager confessed he'd been told to prioritize estate-connected orders over other clients, even if it meant missing deadlines. I kept a notebook in my desk drawer, locked. Every name, every date, every detail went into it. Not because I intended to drag it all into court, though I could, but because I wanted to understand just how deep her reach had gone. By late spring, the tide was visibly turning. Our quarterly numbers were the best in 4 years. A trade magazine ran a feature on Carter Textiles' return to heritage quality. Even the employees at the smaller satellite factories, the ones who'd been most neglected, were sending in thank you notes after we approved funding for long overdue upgrades. And yet I could feel it. Veronica was still out there, watching, waiting for a misstep. One evening, I stopped by the rose garden I'd replanted behind the headquarters. A small plot, nothing like my mother's original, but enough to bring a little life back to the place. The sun was setting, the air rich with the scent of blooms. I stood there for a long moment, remembering how those roses used to mean safety, love, and home. Now, they meant something else too, resilience. The roots had been cut once, but here they were again, pushing through the soil. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Daniel. "Call me. It's important." I didn't know it yet, but the next move she made would be the one that started her real undoing, not in the shadows, but right out in the open, where she'd lose more than she ever thought possible. I called Daniel the moment I saw his text. He answered on the first ring. "Emily, I'm sending you an email right now. You need to read it before the board sees it." Within seconds, the file hit my inbox. It was a scanned copy of a formal complaint, filed anonymously, but clearly intended to stir trouble. The accusation? That I was misappropriating company funds for personal projects and using Carter Textiles resources for unrelated ventures. It was absurd. Every cent of company spending was accounted for, and my own business expenses came straight from my personal account. But the timing was no accident. Veronica had been waiting for the moment the company was stable enough for her to attack, not to destroy it outright, but to smear me so thoroughly that people would hesitate to stand beside me. "This isn't about proving the claim," Daniel said. "It's about perception. If the board smells blood, even false blood, they'll want to protect the company's image." Translation. She wanted to make me look like a liability, just enough to force a power shuffle. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my apartment, going over every transaction, every email, every contract I'd signed since taking over. I wasn't just preparing a defense, I was building something bigger. By morning, I had a plan. The quarterly board meeting was 3 days away. I asked Daniel to quietly confirm who had received copies of the complaint and to make sure all the financial records from the last 2 years were organized, certified, and ready for review. If Veronica wanted to put me on trial, I would let her, but not in the way she expected. The day of the meeting, the atmosphere in the boardroom was taut. Veronica was already seated when I arrived, wearing a navy suit and that familiar smug smile, as if she'd already won. The chairman cleared his throat. "Before we begin with the agenda, there's a matter that's been brought to our attention. Allegations regarding—" I held up a hand. "If I may, I'd like to address this immediately, and I'd like to do it on record." There was a murmur around the table, but no objections. I began by placing a thick binder in the center of the table. Inside this are every financial record, every expense report, every contract signed under my leadership. Each one has been independently audited and certified. I opened to a tab marked Red, revealing a page with large, bold numbers. Carter Textiles' profit margins have increased by 18% in the last 12 months. Employee turnover has dropped by 22%. Client retention is at a record high. Every dollar spent has gone back into the company's operations, quality, and people. I let that sink in before I turned the page. Now, here's something else. Records from the previous administration. There was a flicker in Veronica's eyes. I continued. These reports show unexplained expenses totaling nearly $1.4 million, categorized as miscellaneous estate-related costs. No receipts, no itemization. I didn't have to say her name. Everyone in the room knew exactly whose tenure those numbers belonged to. "Here's the difference," I said finally. "Under my leadership, the company has nothing to hide. Under the previous circumstances, millions were unaccounted for, and yet no formal complaint was ever filed then. So perhaps the real question we should be asking isn't whether Carter Textiles is being mismanaged now, but why such mismanagement was tolerated before. The silence was thick. A few board members exchanged looks. Someone at the far end cleared his throat and muttered, "Well, that's rather telling." I closed the binder and sat back. If anyone would like to proceed with an investigation into my leadership, I welcome it. But let's be thorough and look at the last decade, not just the last year. Veronica's composure cracked for just a second, a tightening around her eyes, a twitch at the corner of her mouth, but she recovered quickly. "It's a clever performance, Emily, but numbers can be spun." I met her gaze. "They can, but documents with your signature on them? Those are harder to explain." The meeting moved on, but the energy in the room had shifted. For the first time, the balance of control wasn't tilting her way. Afterward, Daniel caught up with me in the hallway. "That was clean. You didn't just defend yourself. You made them question her without making it personal. That's going to stick." I nodded, but I knew Veronica wouldn't stop here. She was cornered now, and people like her didn't retreat gracefully. Her next move would be louder, riskier, and if I timed it right, it would also be her last. 2 days later, the opportunity came. A local business journal was hosting a panel discussion on family-run companies and generational leadership. Both Veronica and I had been invited months earlier, back when no one expected us to be at war. The room would be full of industry leaders, investors, and press. She wouldn't be able to resist taking a shot at me there, and when she did, I'd be ready. Not to fight, but to let her hang herself with her own words. The auditorium was buzzing by the time I arrived. Rows of chairs were filling quickly with business owners, industry journalists, and investors. On the stage, a long table draped in white linen held name placards for each speaker. Mine was at the far left. Veronica's was at the far right. I took my seat early, keeping my posture relaxed, a calm expression on my face. Across the table, Veronica was in full performance mode, shaking hands, smiling widely, wearing a deep burgundy dress that practically shouted for attention. She caught my eye briefly and smirked as if to say, "I'm ready for you." The moderator, a polished woman in her 40s, began with introductions. Each panelist spoke briefly about their role and the history of their family's business. I kept mine short, focusing on Carter Textiles' recent resurgence and our return to heritage quality. The applause was polite but warm. Veronica's introduction was longer. She wove in anecdotes about her deep involvement with the Carter brand and her role as steward of the family's legacy. She didn't mention that her role had been almost entirely tied to the estate, not the company itself. The first half of the discussion was tame. We spoke about supply chain challenges, industry shifts, and innovation. I answered questions directly, giving credit to our team and emphasizing the company's workers as the backbone of its success. Then came the moment I knew was coming. The moderator smiled at Veronica. "You've spoken before about the challenges of family transitions. Could you share an example of how family dynamics have affected leadership in your experience?" Veronica's smile widened. "Of course. You know, sometimes in family businesses, certain individuals appear suddenly in leadership roles without the necessary experience. They may have personal connections, but lack the decades of dedication that others have shown." The room shifted. A few heads turned toward me. She continued, her tone sweet but laced with steel. "It's unfortunate when a legacy built over years is suddenly placed in inexperienced hands. The results can be unpredictable." I let a brief silence hang before I spoke. I think what's truly unpredictable is what happens when a company's values are ignored. when decisions are made that serve a handful of people instead of the hundreds of workers who keep the business alive. Inexperience can be addressed with learning, but a disregard for integrity, that's much harder to fix. The moderator's eyebrows rose. Strong words. Do you believe integrity has been an issue in your company's past? I kept my tone even. The numbers speak for themselves. During the years before I took on my role, Carter Textiles saw declining quality, unsafe working conditions, and unexplained expenses totaling over $1 million. That pattern stopped the moment I stepped in. There was a ripple of murmurs through the audience. I didn't have to name her. Anyone paying attention already knew the implication. Veronica's jaw tightened. That's an interesting interpretation. But numbers can be framed however you want. I leaned forward slightly. That's why I've made all our financial records from the last 2 years public to our shareholders, and offered to have the previous decade audited as well. Transparency isn't about framing numbers. It's about putting them where everyone can see them. A man in the second row, an investor I recognized, actually nodded at that. The moderator, sensing the tension, moved the discussion along. But the energy in the room had shifted. By the time the panel ended and we stepped down from the stage, people weren't gathering around Veronica anymore. They were coming to me. One journalist from a major industry magazine asked if she could schedule an interview. A supplier I'd been trying to reconnect with shook my hand firmly and said, "We'll talk next week." Even a few members of the board who'd been lukewarm toward me before leaned in with brief, approving remarks. I caught a glimpse of Veronica near the back of the room, speaking to one of her usual allies, but her smile was tight, her body language sharp. She wasn't holding court anymore. She was defending herself. As I walked out into the late afternoon sun, I realized something important. This wasn't just about winning over the room today. It was about shifting the center of gravity entirely, so that even if she tried to pull another stunt, there'd be no one left willing to stand with her. That evening, Daniel called. "Word travels fast. The panel's already making the rounds online, and I've had 3 shareholders reach out to say they're backing you fully." I exhaled slowly. Good, because I think she's running out of moves. "She is," Daniel agreed. "And when she makes her last one, it'll be the loudest. That's when we make sure it's the one she can't come back from." I hung up and sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on below. My mother's voice came back to me from some faraway memory. When the truth is on your side, you don't have to shout. You just have to stand. And I knew then, the next step wouldn't be me cornering her. It would be letting her corner herself. Spring slid into early summer, and the air in Charleston grew heavy with the scent of magnolia. At Carter Textiles, the numbers continued their quiet climb. Orders were steady, clients were loyal, and the people on the factory floors were smiling more often than I'd ever seen. It was the kind of peace I'd been working toward since the day Daniel first handed me that letter from my father. But in the back of my mind, I knew the storm hadn't passed completely. Veronica had been too quiet for too long. Daniel called me one Tuesday afternoon. "She's making her last move," he said without preamble. "What is it?" "She's trying to sell her remaining influence in the estate, including her symbolic ties to the company name, to one of our competitors. The offer includes access to estate-owned archives and old client lists. If it goes through, it could cause real trouble, even if she doesn't own a single share." I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't about her winning anymore. It was about her leaving a scar on the company just to spite me. "The deal wasn't done yet," Daniel explained. "There was a small legal window to block it. But only if we could prove that her sale would breach certain confidentiality clauses in agreements she'd signed years ago as part of the estate's association with Carter Textiles." "Do we have the proof?" I asked. Daniel hesitated. "We have threads. Enough to pull, maybe enough to unravel the whole thing." That was all I needed to hear. The next few days were a blur. I went through every archived document I could get my hands on. Old contracts, partnership agreements, even handwritten notes my father had kept from meetings. Late on the third night, I found it. A single-page addendum from nearly 15 years ago, signed by both my father and Veronica, stating that all estate-held materials and proprietary business information shall remain confidential and shall not be transferred, sold, or disclosed to any external parties without express written consent from the Carter Textiles Board. It was ironclad. It was. And if she went through with her deal, she'd be in breach and liable for damages that would drain the estate's coffers dry. Daniel drafted the formal notice. It was clean, concise, and impossible to misinterpret. If she attempted to sell, we'd sue for breach of contract, and the damages could exceed the value of what she was selling. We sent it by courier, hand-delivered to her address. The response came the next day, not in writing, but in person. I was in my office when the door opened without a knock. Veronica walked in, wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy weather, and closed the door behind her. "You think you've won," she said flatly. I leaned back in my chair. "I think I've protected the company from someone who's been trying to bleed it for years." Her mouth twisted. "You're just like your mother, self-righteous, always thinking you're better than everyone else." I felt the old heat rise in my chest, but I kept my voice level. "My mother believed in building things worth keeping. You believe in tearing down whatever you can't own. That's the difference." For a moment, I thought she might lunge across the desk. Instead, she slipped off her sunglasses, revealing eyes ringed with exhaustion. "You've taken everything." I shook my head. "No, Veronica. You gave it away. All I did was stop you from taking what wasn't yours." She stared at me for a long beat, then turned and walked out without another word. The sound of her heels echoed down the hallway until it faded completely. That evening, Daniel called to say the deal had been withdrawn. The competitor wanted nothing to do with a potential lawsuit, and Veronica had quietly pulled back the offer. It was over. I should have felt triumphant, but what I felt instead was lighter. For the first time in years, I could breathe without bracing for the next attack. 2 weeks later, I stood in the rose garden behind headquarters, the one we'd replanted last year. The blooms were fuller now, the petals soft and fragrant. I thought of my mother's hands in the dirt, my father's deep voice telling me to build something worth keeping, and how far we'd come from the day I first drove back up that long driveway to the house that had forgotten my name. The company was secure, my place in it was unshakable, and Veronica's shadow no longer stretched over either one, but there was one more thing I needed to do before this chapter could truly close. It was early on a Saturday when I decided to make the drive back to Ashford. The sky was pale blue, streaked with the kind of thin, wispy clouds that seemed to move without wind. I hadn't been to my father's grave since the funeral, not because I wanted to stay away, but because every time I thought about going, the weight in my chest kept me still. But now felt different. The cemetery was quiet when I arrived. The grass was neatly trimmed, the air heavy with the scent of pine. I walked the narrow gravel path toward the Carter family plot, carrying a single bouquet of white roses in my hand. When I reached his headstone, I paused. It was the same simple slab of gray granite I'd seen that day, the one with only his name and dates etched into it. Still no mention of my mother. Still nothing to show the decades they'd shared, the life they'd built together. I knelt and placed the roses at the base. My fingers lingered on the stone, tracing the letters of his name. "Hi, Dad," I said quietly. "I know it's been a while." The words felt strange at first, like speaking to an empty room, but as I sat there, they came easier. "I thought a lot about what you said to me that night, about believing in me. I didn't understand then, but I do now. You didn't just leave me a company, you left me a choice. You trusted me to do something with it. A breeze moved through the trees, gentle but steady. I wish you'd told me sooner. I wish we'd had more time. But I think I'm starting to understand why you couldn't. And I need you to know, it's safe now. The company, the people, even the name. It's all safe. For a long moment, I didn't speak. I just listened to the soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a small tin. Inside were a few rose cuttings from the garden behind headquarters, roses that had grown from the same variety my mother once planted at the old house. "I thought you'd like these," I said, pressing the stems into the soil near the stone. "They're from her roses. I planted them again at the company. They're blooming now." My hands were damp with earth, the scent of the petals rising in the morning air. It felt right. As I stood, I looked out across the cemetery toward the town. Ashford had always been complicated for me, part memory, part scar. But standing here now, I realized something. The place itself hadn't wronged me. It had been people, and those people no longer decided my worth. The road back to Charleston felt shorter than before. The sun climbed higher, lighting up the water as I crossed the bridge into the city. I rolled the windows down, letting the wind tangle my hair. The following Monday, I called a meeting in the main conference room at headquarters, not just for the executives, but for factory supervisors, department heads, and anyone who wanted to come. When everyone had gathered, I stood at the head of the table. "We've been through a lot this past year," I began, "but we're still here, stronger than before, and I want to make sure that strength lasts long after me." I outlined a new program: profit sharing for employees, expanded training opportunities, and a scholarship fund in my parents' names for the children of Carter textiles workers. "This company was built by more than one family," I said. "It was built by all of you, and it's going to keep growing because of all of you." The applause was real, not polite. And as I looked around the room, I saw something I hadn't seen when I first took over: trust. That evening, after most of the staff had gone home, I walked out to the rose garden. The sun was dipping low, casting everything in a golden light. I crouched beside one of the fuller bushes, running my fingers gently over the petals. I thought about my mother's quiet strength, my father's belief in me, and the long road that had brought me here. There had been moments when I thought I wouldn't make it, moments when I nearly let Veronica's voice drown out my own. But I hadn't. I'd stood. And now, in the soft hum of the evening, I knew this was the ending I'd been working toward. Not her defeat, but my peace. As I left the garden, I glanced back one last time. The roses swayed lightly in the breeze, their white blooms catching the last of the sun. And I smiled, knowing that for the first time in years, I wasn't just carrying my parents' legacy, I was living it. And that's how I finally closed the chapter on years of silence, betrayal, and doubt. I didn't win by shouting. I didn't win by tearing anyone down. I won by standing firm, protecting what mattered, and refusing to let anyone rewrite my story. If you've ever been underestimated, pushed aside, told you don't belong, I hope you know this. You don't need their approval to build your life. You don't need their permission to protect what's yours. Sometimes the quietest victory is the one that speaks the loudest. I walked away from that garden knowing I'd done more than defend my father's legacy. I'd created my own, and no one can take that from me. So tell me, have you ever had to fight for something everyone thought you'd lose? Have you ever stood your ground when the easy choice would have been to walk away? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear it. If this story moved you, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe for more real stories of strength, justice, and quiet revenge. Your voice matters here.